A flock of migrating birds suddenly abandoned a quiet marsh. The prehistoric scout stopped walking. No predator could be seen. No sound disturbed the morning air. Yet without hesitation, he quietly led his people away. Hours later, enormous tracks appeared beside the water. How could birds reveal a predator that humans never even saw? For prehistoric scouts, survival depended on seeing danger before danger saw them. Unlike the hunters who traveled with the main group, scouts often moved ahead alone or in small numbers, searching for the safest route through an unpredictable landscape. Every valley, river crossing, marsh, and woodland carried uncertainty. Somewhere beyond the next ridge could be fresh water, abundant game, or an apex predator waiting in perfect silence. The problem was that the most dangerous predators rarely revealed themselves. A smilodon hidden among dense reeds could remain invisible until the final seconds before an attack. Cave lions blended naturally into tall grass. Packs of Ice Age wolves used terrain and teamwork to approach without attracting attention. Even the largest predators relied on remaining unseen for as long as possible. For a scout, waiting until a predator became visible was already too late. Instead of searching only for predators, experienced scouts likely searched for something much easier to observe. The landscape itself, every environment constantly changed in subtle ways. Wind bent the grass. Herds opened new paths through vegetation. Rivers shifted with the seasons. Trees shed their leaves. Birds arrived and departed as migration transformed the sky. Most people today think of migrating birds simply as seasonal travelers. To prehistoric scouts, they may have represented something much more valuable. They crossed enormous distances every year, passing over mountains, wetlands, forests, lakes, and open plains. Their journeys carried them through countless territories occupied by predators. Every stop along the migration route had to be safe enough for hundreds or even thousands of birds to rest, feed, and recover before continuing their journey. Because survival depended on making those decisions correctly, migrating birds became extraordinarily sensitive to changes in their surroundings. Long before humans entered a marsh, a migrating flock might already have flown across it. Long before a hunting party reached a valley, birds might already have rested there, or avoided it altogether. In a sense, the birds were exploring the landscape before the humans arrived. That simple fact may have made them valuable to anyone paying close attention. Prehistoric scouts probably did not understand migration the way modern scientists do. They could not explain navigation, magnetic fields, or seasonal ecology. But they did not need those explanations to recognize a practical pattern. The same birds often appeared during the same seasons. The same wetlands attracted large flocks year after year. The same riverbanks became temporary resting places during migration. Over generations, these repeating events created something every experienced scout depended upon: expectation. When nature behaves consistently, even small changes become noticeable. A familiar marsh suddenly standing empty. A flock refusing to land where it usually rested. Birds changing direction without any obvious reason. These moments stood out precisely because they interrupted an otherwise predictable rhythm. The birds were not intentionally warning humans. They were simply reacting to conditions that affected their own survival. Yet every reaction contained information. Information that a patient observer might learn to recognize. A scout's greatest strength was never superior eyesight. It was careful observation. Rather than focusing on a single object, experienced scouts watched relationships. How animals behaved around water, how herds entered open ground, how the wind carried scent through narrow valleys, and how migrating birds behaved when the landscape below no longer felt safe. Over many years, certain connections may have become difficult to ignore. Unusual bird behavior sometimes appeared before fresh predator tracks were discovered. Resting sites abandoned by migrating flocks occasionally showed signs of large carnivores later that day. Areas where birds hesitated often demanded greater caution from anyone traveling on foot. No single observation proved anything. But survival rarely depended on certainty. It depended on making better decisions than yesterday. The most successful scouts may not have believed that birds could reveal every hidden predator. Instead, they may have understood something much more realistic. If creatures that depended on detecting danger every day suddenly changed their behavior, there was probably a reason worth investigating. That idea transformed ordinary migration into something extraordinary. The birds were no longer just crossing the sky. Without realizing it, they were revealing pieces of the landscape that human eyes could not yet see. And for prehistoric scouts, those hidden pieces of information could become the difference between walking safely through the wilderness or stepping directly into the territory of an unseen apex predator. Watching migrating birds was never about following every movement across the sky. A prehistoric scout was looking for something far more specific: a change. Migration is built on repetition. During the same season, many flocks follow familiar routes, stop at dependable wetlands, and rest in places that have provided food and safety for generations. While the exact path can vary with weather and landscape, the overall rhythm of migration tends to remain surprisingly consistent. Because of that consistency, unusual behavior could stand out immediately to someone who spent years observing it. One of the clearest signs was a sudden change in direction. A flock approaching a marsh might appear ready to descend, only to bank sharply away at the last moment. Instead of continuing toward an ideal resting site, the birds would choose a longer route around it. To the average observer, it might seem unimportant. To an experienced scout, it raised an immediate question. What made the birds avoid that place? Another striking signal was the frantic vertical flush. Rather than taking off gradually, an entire flock would explode almost straight upward before turning away together. This dramatic movement consumed valuable energy, making it an unusual choice during a demanding migration. Something had disturbed the birds enough to abandon a normal departure. Sometimes the warning appeared even before the birds landed. A flock would circle above a wetland several times, drifting lower with each pass as if preparing to rest. Then, without touching the water, it would regroup and continue flying. The habitat looked suitable. The weather appeared calm, yet the birds refused to stop. To a prehistoric scout, that decision itself could become an important clue. The opposite situation could be equally revealing. A marsh that normally attracted migrating birds might remain strangely empty during the peak of the season. Food was plentiful. Water levels were normal. Nothing appeared unusual from the ground. But the expected flocks never arrived. An empty sky where birds were normally abundant may have suggested that something had altered the landscape before humans reached it. Scouts may also have noticed when large flocks unexpectedly split apart. Instead of moving as one coordinated formation, groups separated around the same stretch of terrain before joining together again farther ahead. The destination remained the same, only the route had changed. It was as though the birds preferred to travel around something rather than directly over it. Even repeated circling could become meaningful. Migrating birds occasionally circled to gain altitude, orient themselves, or assess a landing site. But if a flock lingered unusually long above one location before abandoning it altogether, a careful scout might have interpreted that hesitation as another sign that conditions below were not quite right. None of these behaviors identified a predator with certainty. That was never their purpose. Each signal simply suggested that the landscape below deserved greater caution than expected. More importantly, prehistoric scouts likely avoided making decisions based on a single observation. One flock changing direction might have been influenced by shifting winds. Another could have reacted to disturbances unrelated to predators. A single clue was only the beginning. The strongest conclusions came when several unusual behaviors appeared together. A flock refusing to land, another taking off vertically, a third detouring around the same marsh. Individually, each event could have many explanations. Together, they formed a pattern. And patterns are often far more reliable than isolated moments. Over years of travel, experienced scouts may have learned to recognize these recurring combinations. Not because someone explained them. Because the landscape repeated its lessons, the same kinds of unusual bird movements were sometimes followed by the same kinds of discoveries. Fresh tracks pressed into soft mud, recently disturbed vegetation. The unmistakable signs that a large predator had occupied the area. Little by little, observation became expectation. Expectation became judgment. The birds were never pointing directly at a hidden predator. They were revealing that something had interrupted the ordinary rhythm of migration. For a prehistoric scout, that interruption was often reason enough to slow down, observe more carefully, and consider another path. The goal was not to prove that danger existed. The goal was to avoid discovering it the hard way. That simple difference may have kept countless prehistoric travelers one decision ahead of predators they never actually saw. For an apex predator, remaining unseen was everything. Whether it was a smilodon waiting beside a game trail, a cave lion hidden among tall grasses, or a pack of Ice Age wolves moving quietly through a woodland, every successful hunt depended on staying concealed for as long as possible. The less a predator was noticed, the closer it could approach. The closer it approached, the greater the chance of a successful attack. Against animals living on the ground, this strategy was remarkably effective. Dense vegetation blocked their view. Rolling hills concealed movement. Reeds hid even the largest hunters. A predator could remain only a few dozen meters away without ever being seen. From above, however, the same landscape looked very different. To a bird flying over a marsh or circling above a forest edge, the terrain formed a broad, continuous picture rather than a series of narrow sightlines. The predator was still hidden, but it was no longer hidden in exactly the same way. A narrow corridor of flattened reeds, a winding trail pressed through tall grass, a section of vegetation moving against the surrounding pattern. Subtle changes that might disappear at ground level could become far easier to notice from the air. Just as importantly, Birds did not need to recognize the predator itself. They only needed to recognize that something below was behaving differently from the ordinary landscape. A stalking Smilodon rarely crossed open ground in a straight line. It moved slowly, paused frequently, shifted direction with its prey. Each movement disturbed vegetation in small but detectable ways. The same was true for cave lions slipping through tall grass, or wolves spreading quietly across a valley before surrounding a herd. Every hunting strategy left traces, not dramatic ones, small disturbances that accumulated as the predator moved. A ripple across shallow water, grass bending where there was no wind, reeds separating before slowly closing again, branches trembling without a passing breeze. None of these signs lasted very long. But migrating birds searching for safe places to rest constantly scanned the landscape below. Even brief changes could influence whether a flock decided to descend or remain airborne. Evolution helps explain why these reactions became so sensitive. For millions of years, birds and predators have shaped each other's behavior through natural selection. Predators that approached quietly caught more prey. Birds that noticed danger earlier survived more often. Generation after generation, individuals with faster reactions were more likely to live long enough to reproduce. Over immense spans of time, this evolutionary pressure produced birds that responded quickly to uncertain situations. Waiting for complete certainty carried enormous risk. Escaping unnecessarily consumed energy. Failing to escape a real predator could cost a life. Natural selection consistently favored caution. As a result, many birds react not only to obvious threats but also to subtle changes that suggest danger may be nearby. Modern ecology has documented similar patterns in many ecosystems. Birds frequently alter their behavior when large terrestrial predators move through their habitat, even before direct contact occurs. The exact response depends on the species, the environment, and the type of predator involved, but the underlying principle remains consistent. Predators influence far more than the animals they intend to hunt. Their presence ripples through the surrounding ecosystem. Every apex predator creates what ecologists sometimes call a landscape of fear. Animals become more alert, movement patterns change, feeding behavior shifts, some areas are temporarily avoided altogether. Migrating birds passing through these landscapes become part of that larger ecological response. They are not observing the predator for the benefit of humans. They are simply responding to environmental risk in ways that increase their own chances of survival. From the ground, these responses may appear sudden and unpredictable. From the perspective of ecology, they are entirely logical. A flock abandoning an otherwise suitable marsh is not behaving randomly. It is making a survival decision based on information humans may not yet possess. That is what made the sky such a valuable source of information. The predator remained hidden from view, but it could not move through the landscape without changing it. And once the landscape changed, the birds often changed with it. Long before the predator ever revealed itself, the wilderness had already begun reacting. The sky was simply the first place where those reactions became visible. Observing unusual bird behavior was only the first step. The real challenge was deciding what that information meant. A prehistoric scout could never know with absolute certainty that a hidden predator was waiting ahead. The landscape offered clues, not guarantees. The scout's task was to transform those clues into practical decisions. Rather than seeing the wilderness as simply safe or dangerous, experienced scouts may have learned to think in terms of changing levels of risk. Every observation slightly altered that invisible picture. A normal migration route suggested that nothing unusual had disturbed the area. An unexpected change suggested caution. Several unusual changes occurring in the same place suggested even greater caution. Imagine a migrating flock approaching a broad marsh. Instead of descending together, the birds suddenly turn east. A few minutes later, another flock reaches the same marsh. It circles twice before continuing without landing. Soon afterward, a third flock approaches from another direction. It follows almost the same detour as the first, 3 separate flocks. 3 similar decisions. For an experienced scout, this was no longer a coincidence. The birds had not revealed what was hidden below. They had revealed where something had disrupted the normal landscape. At that moment, the scout faced a choice. Continue through the marsh as originally planned, or change the route before learning the answer firsthand. In many situations, choosing the safer path required surprisingly little information. The purpose was never to locate the exact position of a predator. The purpose was to reduce the chance of encountering one. Sometimes that meant walking around a wetland instead of crossing it. Sometimes it meant avoiding a narrow valley until later in the day. Sometimes it meant selecting another river crossing several hundred meters upstream. Each decision carried a cost. The journey became longer. More energy was spent. Hunting opportunities might be delayed. But compared with the risk of walking directly into an ambush, those costs were often acceptable. As scouts gathered more observations, the landscape gradually became easier to interpret. A disturbed marsh increased concern. If nearby flocks behaved normally, the unusual activity might be limited to one location. If unusual behavior spread across several neighboring wetlands, the area of concern became much larger. Instead of thinking about a single point, scouts may have begun thinking about zones of higher and lower risk. The wilderness slowly transformed into an invisible map. Not a map drawn on stone. A map built from observation, bird movement became one layer. Animal tracks added another. Wind direction offered another. Freshly disturbed vegetation contributed more information. No single clue determined the final decision. Each clue either strengthened or weakened the others. The most experienced scouts were unlikely to trust one sign alone. Instead, they compared everything the landscape revealed before deciding which path offered the greatest chance of safety. This approach also reduced unnecessary caution. If migrating birds behaved normally while fresh herbivore tracks covered the ground, the route might still appear relatively safe. If bird behavior suddenly changed but no other unusual signs appeared, the scout might simply slow down and observe rather than immediately changing direction. Careful judgment mattered just as much as careful observation. Over many seasons, repeated decisions probably refined this process even further. Certain marshes consistently produced unusual bird behavior. Some valleys repeatedly caused migrating flocks to alter their route. Other places remained peaceful year after year. Patterns slowly emerged. Those patterns became expectations, and those expectations helped transform scattered observations into dependable survival strategies. The birds never drew a map. They simply revealed where the landscape no longer behaved as expected. The scout completed the map by connecting those scattered pieces of information. Every change in flight direction, every abandoned resting site, every unusual detour became another marker on an invisible chart of risk. The predator remained hidden. But with every movement of the migrating birds, its influence spread across the landscape. The scout's greatest skill was recognizing that invisible pattern before taking the next step. Because sometimes the safest route was not the shortest one. It was the one the birds had quietly chosen first. Not every unusual movement in the sky meant an apex predator was nearby. That may have been one of the hardest lessons prehistoric scouts ever learned. If every flock that changed direction was treated as a deadly warning, travel would become painfully slow. Hunting opportunities would be missed. Valuable water sources would be abandoned without reason. Entire days could be wasted avoiding dangers that never existed. A successful scout needed something far more valuable than caution. He needed judgment. The first source of confusion was the weather. A strong crosswind could force migrating birds to alter their route without any threat on the ground. Rising warm air might cause a flock to gain altitude earlier than expected. A passing storm could scatter birds long before the rain arrived. From below, these changes might resemble a warning. In reality, they were simply normal responses to changing atmospheric conditions. The landscape itself could also influence migration. Steep cliffs created shifting air currents. Wide rivers redirected flight paths. Mountain ridges funneled birds through narrow corridors. A sudden change in direction did not always mean something dangerous was waiting below. Sometimes the safest path through the sky was simply following the terrain. Large herbivores created another challenge. Herds of mammoths, bison, giant deer, or wild horses could disturb resting birds as they moved across wetlands or open plains. A flock lifting into the air might have reacted to thousands of heavy footsteps rather than a stalking predator. For a scout, the movement looked dramatic, but the cause was entirely different. Even humans could trigger the same response. Another hunting party moving through reeds, families collecting water, or travelers crossing a riverbank could all cause birds to abandon an area temporarily. The birds reacted to disturbance itself, not to the identity of whatever caused it. That is why experienced scouts likely avoided trusting a single sign. Instead, they searched for agreement between multiple clues. If migrating birds suddenly avoided a marsh, and fresh predator tracks appeared in soft mud, and grazing animals were strangely absent, the evidence became much stronger. If the birds changed direction but everything else appeared normal, the scout might simply watch a little longer before making a decision. Time itself became another tool. A temporary disturbance often disappeared quickly. If birds returned to a resting site after only a few minutes, the original cause may have been brief and harmless. If flock after flock continued avoiding the same location throughout the day, the possibility of an ongoing danger became much more difficult to ignore. Experience also taught that different places behaved differently. Some wetlands naturally attracted large numbers of migrating birds. Others served only as occasional resting sites. Certain valleys regularly created unusual wind patterns. Some lakes remained calm even during seasonal storms. Understanding these local differences was just as important as watching the birds themselves. A signal could only be interpreted correctly when compared with what was normally expected in that particular landscape. Over many years, scouts may have developed an unwritten habit that guided every important decision. Never ask whether the birds are behaving strangely. Ask whether today's behavior is strange for this place, at this season, under these conditions. That simple distinction separated observation from understanding. It also reduced one of the greatest dangers in survival: false confidence. Not sure rarely provides perfect answers. Most of the time, it offers probabilities. A wise scout accepted uncertainty instead of pretending it did not exist. The goal was never to eliminate risk completely. That would have been impossible in the prehistoric world. The goal was to make better decisions than someone who ignored the signs altogether. Migrating birds were only one source of information. But when their movements were compared with weather, terrain, animal tracks, and the behavior of other wildlife, they became part of a much larger picture, not a perfect warning system, a reliable decision-making system. And in a world where a single mistake could cost an entire hunting party its future, that difference may have been one of humanity's greatest survival advantages. A young scout watches a flock suddenly change direction. He starts to turn away immediately. The older scout quietly raises a hand. Wait, one flock means nothing. Watch the next one. The young scout kept watching. Only much later would he understand why the older scout had waited. The ability to read migrating birds was never something a person could master in a single season. It was learned slowly. Observation after observation, journey after journey, year after year, a young scout might notice the same flock as an experienced one. But seeing was not the same as understanding. To an inexperienced observer, migrating birds simply arrived, rested, and continued their journey. To a veteran scout, every flight carried context. He remembered where the birds usually landed. He remembered when they normally arrived. He remembered how they behaved during calm weather, strong winds, and changing seasons. Without that memory, unusual behavior would have been impossible to recognize. Training almost certainly began with patience rather than action. Young scouts first had to learn what normal looked like. They watched migration routes through different seasons. They observed which wetlands consistently attracted large flocks. They learned which valleys birds crossed directly and which they naturally avoided because of terrain. Only after understanding these regular patterns could they recognize meaningful changes. Experience gradually transformed isolated observations into lasting knowledge. One unexpected detour meant very little. The same detour appearing over several migration seasons became something worth remembering. One abandoned resting site might have been coincidence. Repeated abandonment during the same season suggested a recurring pattern. Over time, memory became one of the scouts' most valuable tools. Knowledge was also built through comparison. Experienced scouts encourage younger observers to compare today's migration with yesterday's. Compare this marsh with the next one. Compare this season with the previous one. Compare one flock with another approaching from a different direction. The goal was never to memorize individual birds. It was to recognize patterns that remained consistent despite changing conditions. Some lessons could only be learned by traveling the same routes again and again. The landscape itself became the classroom. Each migration season added another layer of experience. Every successful journey strengthened confidence in certain observations. Every mistake refined future judgment, not because nature became easier to understand, but because the scouts became better at asking the right questions. Teaching probably relied far more on demonstration than explanation. An experienced scout might quietly stop at the edge of a marsh and simply watch the sky. The younger scouts watched with him. Nothing was said. After several minutes, a flock altered its course and continued toward another wetland. Only then would the older scout continue walking, allowing the lesson to settle naturally. Observation came first. Explanation came later. That method encouraged younger scouts to notice changes for themselves rather than waiting to be told what they meant. Perhaps the most important lesson of all was humility. No experienced scout could predict every danger. No one understood every movement of migrating birds. Nature always contained uncertainty. Good scouts accepted that uncertainty instead of pretending to eliminate it. They questioned their own conclusions. They looked for additional evidence. They remained willing to change their decision if new information appeared. That habit may have been just as important as any specific skill they possessed. Over generations, these practices likely became part of the group's shared survival knowledge, not written in books, not carved into stone, preserved through memory, repeated journeys, careful observation, and the quiet instruction of experienced scouts teaching those who would one day guide the next generation. The migrating birds never changed their behavior for humans. The scouts changed the way they observed the birds. And that difference may have allowed knowledge to survive long after individual people were gone. One generation watched the sky. The next generation learned how to understand what it was seeing. Although no written record tells us exactly how prehistoric scouts interpreted migrating birds, modern ecology demonstrates that changes in bird behavior often reflect changes occurring elsewhere in the environment. Field biologists studying large mammals frequently pay attention to the behavior of surrounding wildlife while surveying remote landscapes. Birds may suddenly abandon feeding areas. Flocks may avoid certain wetlands. Normal activity may briefly disappear before the source of disturbance becomes visible. These observations are never treated as proof on their own. Instead, they become one piece of a much larger picture. Researchers compare bird behavior with tracks, terrain, weather conditions, camera data, and other environmental evidence before reaching a conclusion. In many ways, this follows the same principle that prehistoric scouts may have relied upon. No single clue is enough. Several independent clues pointing in the same direction create a stronger understanding of what may be happening beyond direct sight. Many indigenous tracking traditions around the world also emphasize careful observation of the entire landscape, rather than focusing on one animal alone. Birds, hoofed mammals, wind, water, vegetation. Each contributes information about changing conditions. The environment functions as an interconnected system where one species often reacts to another. Modern science explains these relationships through ecology. Predators influence prey. Prey influence other animals. Those changes spread throughout the ecosystem, sometimes reaching creatures that were never the predator's intended target. Migrating birds become part of that ecological network. They are responding to changes that improve their own chances of survival. Humans who notice those responses may gain useful information without ever seeing the original cause. This does not mean birds can reliably reveal every hidden predator. Nature is far too complex for simple rules. Weather changes. Habitats differ. Species respond in different ways. Every observation must be understood within its own environmental context, yet the underlying principle remains remarkably consistent. The wilderness is constantly exchanging information. Those who learn to recognize its patterns often understand far more than those who watch only a single piece of the landscape. Perhaps that is why careful observation has remained one of humanity's oldest survival tools. Technology has changed. The world has changed. But the habit of learning from nature has never disappeared. Long before humans built warning systems, the wilderness was already providing them. The scouts who survived were not always the strongest. They were the ones who learned to read the sky before stepping into the unknown.